Last time on The Roots of Everything, in our part 2 of secularism, we had just seen Christendom destroyed, ravaged by the 30 Years' War. And on this, episode 3 of our 4-part series on secularism, we will see what happened as an aftermath. What happened to Europe after Christendom? So, the 30 Years' War ravaged Christendom, not just physically, millions and millions dead, but spiritually. So some of the effects we talked about last time was that religion had become a matter of personal opinion. The rule of the conscience had become pretty much the major guiding star for what religious conviction was about. And what this means is that people can't have these things in common. If religion becomes intensely personal and ultimately or primarily personal, then you can't use it as a basis on which to run and structure society. So society as a whole has to become secularized. So what now? Now we need a new way not only to run society, but to view the world. In other words, our imaginative framework has to change. Europe needs a new imaginative framework because the old framework, the framework that had established Christendom, that had built Christendom out of the previous pagan civilization, was now largely invalid, not shared, not something we could hold in common as a society. No more Christendom. Okay, so what happens now? Now we need a new story, a new mythic story specifically. So mythic stories are important because by myth, we don't mean it's not real. It's not real. We mean a myth is a type of genre. So a mythic story is one that takes your story and roots it in a cosmic story, in a story with meaning and purpose, right? So ancient people didn't just write secular histories of their own society. Their histories always start with some kind of a mythic narrative about what? The gods, the cosmos, and the whole process and motion of history. So a theory of history, this is a really important term for you to know. If you're interested in imaginative framework, the history of ideas, all this stuff, you need a theory of history model. So what do I mean by this? Every story, every mythic story, every society, everyone has to tell themselves a theory about history. What does history mean? Because you can't just rattle off names and dates. People used to say, oh, history's boring, it's just names and dates, who cares? Yeah, that's because there's no imaginative mythic framework to contextualize those names and dates and tell you what they mean. What's the meaning of things? So a mythic story, a model for history, has to explain the facts of history in a way that makes them make sense as a story. Again, I gave this example last time. If I say, how was your day today? And you list off, at 7:01, my alarm went off. I hit snooze. At 7:05, I woke up, and blah, blah, blah. And you tell me all the things in order, you're not really answering my question. Why? Because I'm asking you what the meaning of your day was. I had a good day. I had a bad day. That's interpretive. That's and I'm not saying, oh, that's bad, it's biased, blah, blah, blah. No, that's what I'm asking. What's the story of your day? Because a story has a moral. A story has a meaning. It's not just a list of timestamps. All of this to say that Christianity, like the pagan civilization before it, had a mythic story with a theory of history. What did history mean? There was all this human history. Christ came and became incarnate as a man. All these things happened. He ascended into heaven. He's going to return. There's going to be an end to history. The kingdom is coming. This is a model for history. What does history mean? So, of course, now we need a new one. So what happened? So what happened was, and we're going to skip the Renaissance, I think, for this series. We can come back to this in another series. But the next important touchstone in the story of secularism is the Enlightenment. So the Enlightenment is this movement that happens after Christendom falls apart. And it's sort of this attempt to rebuild and move forward with all the things that we're talking about for Europe. Mythic story, imaginative framework, etc. And it's going to be drawing on the old Christendom paradigm, but secularized, meaning we like all these things. We like human rights. We like radical human dignity. We like reason. We like all this stuff from the medieval era. We like the university system. We like literacy. But we don't like this theology bit because we can't agree about it, or because now we're all resentful about how much hypocrisy was going on during things like the 30 Years' War, Reformation, all this stuff. So we need to tell ourselves a new story about history that makes sense out of these events, that isn't the old Christian story. So I'm going to give you a quote. This is somebody who did a text. He did a book on this topic, and I'm going to hide. The name of the author will be disguised until later of the show, and I will reveal it later at a certain point. You'll see why. So this quote is him summarizing the story that the Enlightenment era thinkers told themselves about all the things that had happened in the previous world. So it goes something like this. Once upon a time, Western humanity was the cosseted and incurious ward of Mother Church. During this, the age of faith, culture stagnated, science languished, wars of religion were routinely waged, witches were burned by inquisitors, and Western humanity labored in brutish subjugation to dogma, superstition, and the unholy alliance of church and state. All was darkness. So this is where the Dark Ages stereotype comes from. Then, in the wake of the wars of religion that had torn Christendom apart, came the full flowering of the Enlightenment, and with it, the reign of reason and progress, the riches of scientific achievement and political liberty, and a new and revolutionary sense of human dignity. The secular nation-state arose and thereby rescued Western humanity from the blood-steeped intolerance of religion. Intolerance and religion, these go together in this paradigm. Now at last, Western humanity has left its nonage and attained to its majority in science, politics, and ethics, meaning you were a kid and now you've come of age. And then, so remarking on all of this, the author who's summarizing the Enlightenment narrative, you see how this is mythic. You see how this is rooted in the new imaginative framework of the Enlightenment. So it's taken all these wars of religion and it's incorporated them into this narrative about the place of science and the Middle Ages or the Dark Ages, all this stuff. Okay, so remarking on this tale, and again, you guys have probably heard some form or another of this story, which we talked about last week. Remarking on this narrative, the author in question who's summarizing it says, "This is, as I say, a simple and enchanting tale, easily followed and utterly captivating in its explanatory tidiness," meaning it's a very simple story, easy to follow. And then he says, its sole defect is that it happens to be false in every identifiable detail, which is true, but we can't, and of course we can't get into all the details, but I want to touch on the most important ways in which it's false, do a little myth busting, and now in a double sense of the word. And I really want on this episode to give you a sense of what characterized the Enlightenment, especially in the context of the age that came before it, the Christian age. And so you can start to see how the Enlightenment is kind of a Christian heresy in the sense that it takes pieces from the old Christian world and then changes them, picks and chooses. That's what heresy means. It's a Greek word from the same word we use the word eclectic, same root word. So they pick and choose, and then they present this new vision, the secular enlightened vision for the world. And you're going to see, obviously, how this influences us today. So there's a few themes going on here. One is their new narrative of history is that there was this previous age of darkness. Then there was a Renaissance, which means rebirth. And then there was the Enlightenment. So just in these, like the Dark Ages, the rebirth, and the Enlightenment, just in the naming convention, you can already see the incredible, I want to say bias, even though I don't like that word, but you see the bias. You see the narrative that they had, the value judgments that they're making about these things. And so a lot of the rhetoric that comes out in this period has to do with certain dichotomies. So, for example, faith and reason. The whole idea that faith and reason have this dichotomy to them, that there's faith or there's reason, and how do we reconcile these two things? that would have been complete nonsense to the first 1,000 years of Christianity. They would not have understood why you were making this dichotomy. But it became a dichotomy later in the Enlightenment. And of course, we have this dichotomy now, and we'll talk about that at the end, why exactly that is. Another one, freedom versus authority. So there's all this concern about different types of government and democracy, understood in a very different way than it was in somewhere like ancient Athens, by the way. This idea that all men should get to vote on whatever, like that's a new way of conceiving of society based on this new idea that authority had become sort of inherently problematic, inherently abusive, inherently exploitive, oppressive, etc. These are words that people associate with the idea of authority and hierarchy. You say authority and hierarchy to a medieval person, and they're like, yeah, that's how the universe works. And you say that to a modern person, and they're like, they have an allergic reaction to this. So with all of this, I'm just giving some themes, and then we're going to get into the details. Another theme is what I would call a kind of triumphalism. So what I mean by that is that when you read Enlightenment thinkers, there's this incredible sense of triumphalism, that they are coming into the victory of man over the world. We will do it. We can conquer anything. We will use reason. We will use science. We'll exploit nature. We're going to conquer the whole universe. We're going to become the masters of everything. It's like, this is not the ambition of medieval or ancient man. The pagans and the Christians did not conceive of themselves as this sort of triumphalistic conquering of all of space and time, the way the Enlightenment thinkers do. It's really quite startling when you think about it. Now, if you grew up watching StarCraft, that's a different generation. If you grew up watching Star Trek, then you're going to have a sense of this kind of enlightenment, especially next generation, this sort of triumphalist, like, yes, we've overcome poverty and we've overcome ignorance with education and the correct economic system, and especially technology. We're going to overcome all of these things that constrained us before, and we will become conquerors of everything. And then we'll just adventure freely and do whatever we want. That's a triumphalist, enlightenment, and utopian vision of the world. Not present in previous imaginative frameworks for Christendom and pagandom. So in other words, so these are some themes. These are all highly specific narrative focuses for what the Enlightenment thinkers told themselves about the world and about their place in the world and about their place in history, especially. So what I want to say in summarizing these themes is that these are not neutral ideas. I just want to point that out at the beginning, because the Enlightenment thinking that was still with us today in different forms, we'll get into that next week, has this idea that science and reason and progression of society and technology are all kind of neutral things. They don't have any biases. It's just very neutral. It's very normal. These are just things you do. Science is objective. Reason is objective. Technology growing and making things more prosperous. These are all objective things. They don't have any worldview bias to them because they're not religious. Well, if you listen to this show at all, you know that I think that there is no such thing as a neutral worldview. There's no neutrality. There's no view from nowhere. That's what some of the postmodernists critique this idea. They call it's the view from nowhere. And of course, there is no view from nowhere. There's always a view from somewhere, from somebody's perspective. And the triumphalism sort of is part of this, right? Like we get to decide. We get to be the lords and masters of fate. And it's religion is biased, but the Enlightenment is neutral and objective. Now, I hope you start to see where that breaks down. Okay, so what are some of these? That's the overview. What are some of these Enlightenment ideas that are part of? I want to get into. Well, let's see. Probably 6, maybe 7 of these ideas. We'll see what we have time for. Whatever we don't have time for, we'll roll into next week. I'm seeing in chat, the 20th century truly reached the pinnacle of ethics. Yes, yes. This is an ironic statement for those of you just tuning in. I will absolutely get into this next week. Next week, we're going to talk all about the 20th century. This is a good moment to check chat. Dr. Porcu, the work you and Father Strickland are doing is so invaluable. Thank you. I love Father Strickland's books. I just think they're completely great because, and again, actually, this is a good time because he presents an orthodox narrative of history. He's not just recounting history. He's not just listing a bunch of facts. He's actually giving you a narrative about history from an orthodox perspective. And that's really important and it's really valuable because our church histories tend to be written by Catholics and Protestants and atheists in the West because that's our cultural legacy. So to get a history that's written from the perspective of an orthodox thinker is new and valuable. And, because again, none of these are neutral. The atheist perspective on history is not neutral, nor is the Protestant or Catholic or anything. So it's important to have this orthodox alternative. I think that's incredible. So, and yes, thank you for joining everyone who's here live. Love seeing you guys in the chat. Put whatever you want in the chat. We'll get into it. Okay, so I want to look at 6, maybe 7 of these things in a little bit more particular detail. These are the Enlightenment themes that the Enlightenment ends up really establishing and then how it influences our world today. So, we need tea to keep going. So, one of the most important ones, I think, that a lot of people don't talk about is mechanism, this belief in a mechanistic process for how you view the world, how you view reality. And we talked about this a little bit in the first episode of Secularism. We said there's the ancient and Christian pre-modern worldview was personal. Persons, there's spirits everywhere, gods, angels, nature, all these kind of things. And then there's the shift in modernity towards this idea of mechanism, meaning you think about the world as a machine. The universe is mechanical, not personal or mysterious. And this, I think, is probably the most important feature to understand about how the Enlightenment thinkers thought about the world, because everything follows from it. So I've got a whole bunch of quotes for you today. I just couldn't stop pulling out quotes that I'd like from the primary sources mostly. And this will give you a good idea. So buckle up. Okay. So the first one is from David Hume. If you know him, we're going to talk about him later. I want to do an episode or a series just on modern philosophers so we can really get into it. But random quotes for today. So David Hume, in his dialogues concerning natural religion, he says this, quote, "Contemplate the world and every part of it. You will find it to be nothing but one great machine, subdivided into an infinite number of lesser machines, which again admit of subdivisions to a degree beyond what human senses and faculties can trace and explain. All these various machines, and even the most minute parts, are adjusted to each other with an accuracy which ravishes into admiration all men who have ever contemplated them." So this last part is just him kind of nerding out about how cool it is. But you see the imagery here, the core imagery is, and the language, the reductive language. You will find it to be nothing but one great machine. In other words, it's just a machine. And it's subdivided into an infinite number of lesser machines. Mechanical view of the universe, very, very different than the era that came before it. And of course, this doesn't just stop with the universe. So now we have Thomas Hobbes, author of Leviathan, whom you may know. So he says, "For what is the heart but a spring, and the nerves but so many strings, and the joints but so many wheels, giving motion to the whole body." Okay, so if the whole universe is a mechanism, man is a mechanism too. And so if the whole universe is a mechanism, if it's a machine that follows laws and rules and precise ordering, the image that they like to use was a mechanical clock. By the way, the mechanical clock is a medieval invention. Very complicated, very cool. And at this point, side note, people also had calculators. They were not digital. They were actually purely mechanical calculators meaning all these switches inside. It's basically a computer, a very primitive computer, and they do switch work, not with a silicon chip or electricity, but actually with mechanical switches. So for a younger generation, this example is not for people who, let's say, are older than me, but Minecraft. So for all of you Minecraft players out there, if you've ever done redstone switch work in Minecraft to make doors open or automate things, you probably know that you can actually make a calculator or a computer just using these mechanical switches. And it's gigantic, just like these adding machines were in real life. And the thing about computers is you can make it's the same thing. All ChatGPT is like a bunch of redstone, basically. But it's just really small. So if the whole universe is this giant machine and we can understand its laws, which again is not something the pagans would have thought. They're like, well, I don't know, Zeus runs everything and we don't know what he wants, and you better not try to make wings and fly because you're going to get shot down. Know your place, mortal. That's not a pagan idea of the world. So if the whole universe is a machine, then we can know it. We can know it really well, and it's predictable, it's regular, it's a machine. So this leads to the famous thought experiment that's now called Laplace's demon. So Pierre-Simon Laplace was a French mathematician, he talked about it like this. He has this quote: "An intelligence," meaning some kind of mind or spirit, not a human one probably, but he says, "an intelligence knowing at a given instant of time all forces acting in nature, as well as the momentary positions of all things of which the universe consists," meaning he knows where every atom and molecule is in the entire universe. If someone knew all of that, he would, I'm quoting now, would be able to comprehend the motions of the largest bodies of the world and those of the smallest atoms in one single formula, provided it were sufficiently powerful to subject the data to analysis. To it, nothing would be uncertain. Both future and past would be present before its eyes. So this ends up being called Laplace's demon, because it's the idea that there's this intelligence, like a demon or an angel spirit, and if that had the processing power, to put it in modern terms, of knowing the exact position of every atom and molecule in the whole universe right now, then it could accurately predict. So if it had all information about the universe, it could accurately predict not only the future, but the past, because you just work backwards and figure out what happened in the past, and then you work forwards and figure out what happened in the future. So this is really weird, I think, because it's basically what we're doing now with ChatGPT and all this large language modeling stuff, because it's based on a mechanistic view of the universe. So if all knowledge in the universe is knowable, and we just have to get really good at it, and then we get enough processing power, we can predict anything that will happen and recreate anything that has happened with perfect accuracy, just with enough processing power. Okay, you might kind of think that that's a little science fiction-y, but if you have a paradigm to understand that, that's because you're viewing the world as a giant machine, as a giant mechanism. They said clock then. Today we would say simulation, computer program. But really, let's be real, a computer program, no matter how complicated, is just a really complicated version of a switch turning on and off, just like a bajillion of them, right? we're going to do a series on science and technology and the occult pretty soon here, I think two after this one. So we'll get into that more. But again, mechanistic view of reality. Okay, so that's all of reality. And we heard from Thomas Hobbes that the human being is, what is the heart but a spring? Okay, so the cosmos is mechanized, the human is mechanized. What about society? So this is Adam Smith. You may have heard of him. He says, human society, when we contemplate it in a certain abstract and philosophical light, appears like a great immense machine whose regular and harmonious movements produce 1,000 agreeable effects. So society is like a machine. Last week or the week before, somebody said, yeah, if you view the world in this way, then utopia is just an engineering problem. Yeah, that's what they thought. They're like, oh, well, we understand how the world works. We understand how humans work. We've reduced all these things to these mechanistic elements that obey laws and are predictable. So we should be able to do an engineering feat and create the perfect society as well. Why not? You see how incredibly triumphalist this is, and realistically, how arrogant it is, right? Because especially compared, and I'm not just saying like, I don't like the Enlightenment guys, they're arrogant jerks. No, I'm saying compared to the medievals and the pagans, they're objectively more confident in the human's ability to master the cosmos than those people were, right? So commenting on this, so I have a quote here from Alan Wheelis, who's a secondary source, but he compiled all of this stuff. He wrote the book, The End of the Modern Age. Very interesting. So he comments on all this, and he says, in the Enlightenment period, the dream of mechanism washed over Western thought. The humanities strove to become sciences, in each science to become physics. Biology chased after chemistry, chemistry chased after mathematics, the ultimate destination in every field always being the final elementary particle. In other words, there's this movement from more abstracted things, less mechanized things, to try to reduce them to mechanized things. So the humanities want to become sciences. And each one within the sciences, each one of the sciences wants to get more and more mechanical. Biology wants to become chemistry because it's more basic than biology. Chemistry wants to become physics, which is more basic. Physics wants to become mathematics, like pure math. So in other words, and you might think, well, okay, well, that just makes sense. There's a hierarchy of fields that are more pure or less pure. There's an old XKCD comic. I should have brought that up. There's an old XKCD comic about this, fields arranged by purity. And the joke is this, but then the joke is like the mathematician is all the way on the other side and he's the most pure. And he's like, oh, I didn't see you guys over there. And this is perhaps basic to you, but it's filtered through a particular worldview, a mechanized worldview. And what we mean, what's a huge part of that is reductionism. So if I say something's reductive, or people are being reductive when they say XYZ, if they say, oh, it's just a tree. If you say love is just a chemical reaction, you're being reductive about love. You're reducing it all the way down to some mechanized, again, not personal. So if you've ever been in love, if you love somebody romantically, friendship, family, whatever, you don't experience it as a mechanistic process. It has a reality to it that you know because you're there. And then maybe you put on your intellectual hat and you say, well, it's just, these kinds of hormones and blah, 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 survival, evolutionary psychology, whatever. But that's being reductive. You're taking one phenomena and saying, oh, it's just this other phenomena. Meaning what you experience is not really that important, or it's not the most primary reality. That's really what you're saying when you do reductionism on it. And again, that's not neutral. That's not a neutral worldview. The idea of taking this image of mechanization and forcing everything in the human experience into this idea of mechanism is not a neutral worldview. I mean, punchline, there are no neutral worldviews, so maybe I'm just being tautological here, but I want you to appreciate this, because the Enlightenment always sells its worldview as though it were neutral, and it's not. There's no necessary reason why. Why should they be a machine? Why? You just, oh, okay, I guess it is. So I'm going to end this part by giving one more quote from Alan Wheelis, who's talking about Newton. And Newton we'll get into more when we do the series on science. Excuse me. But Newton, there's a lot of reasons why Newton's important. And one of them is the methodology change that he makes. So he's the kind of Enlightenment reaction to the medieval world is they want to say, like, look, we don't know why things happen. All that God stuff and cosmology, we're not going to talk about it because we can't prove it. We don't know. We're not going to mention. We're just going to say what we observe. We're just going to do observation. We're just going to do empiricism, meaning only the things that you can prove from observation and scientific analysis. And that's all we're going to record. We're going to be super neutral about it. We're not going to get religion involved. Sounds nice on paper, but the problem is you still end up forcing your worldview of mechanism onto the situation. I'll explain. Here's the quote from Alan Wheelis. So he says, he's talking about Newton, he makes such a point of not knowing why this is so, meaning the laws of physics, that we fail altogether to note the conjecture which has slipped in without question, namely that it is so, that the universe is a machine. We come to believe that laws of nature exist, that they reside in nature, silent, invisible, and eventually are discovered by man. Whereas in fact, they are created by man, with nature sitting as model, meaning sitting as model like when artists will draw a live model and the model's just sitting there and you draw the model. And the reason he makes this comparison is because the drawing is not the model. That's what we mean by model. We say, oh, this is a model for how the universe works. It's a model. It's not the reality of it. It's something we make up. It's a construct. Continuing the quote, natural law is but the new name for the same old absolute truth which in the Middle Ages was to be found in Holy Writ. In other words, he identifies this push to establish a new kind of absolute way of looking at the universe with just an extension, this is back to the Christian heresy thing, of the idea that there's absolute truth in the Middle Ages. Holy Writ, the popes, the church has absolute truth. Okay, the Enlightenment's going to have absolute truth too. We just move the pieces around to make it a different kind of absolute truth. But the concept of this absolute noble truth is still there. So, and this quote may have been a little much. Let me break it down one more time real quick. So this beginning part's important. He makes such a point of not knowing why this is so, meaning, well, why are there laws? I don't know, but we're just going to describe them, that we fail to notice the conjecture that slipped in, meaning he assumes something into it, namely that it is so. In other words, well, the universe just follows these laws and we don't know why, but we're going to describe them. It's like, okay, what's the assumption that he's sneaked in there? That the universe follows mechanical laws. How did we establish that? How did we prove that? It's like, well, we do this experiment over and over again, and most of the time this thing happens. That doesn't mean there are laws. What do you mean by laws? Did you get them from Moses on Mount Sinai, on stone tablets? No. You see, the medieval language is still here. The idea that there are divine cosmic laws that man just needs to discover, that's really a medieval scholastic way of viewing the world. And the Enlightenment thinkers just took it and looked at it and said, oh, well, we're just going to secularize this idea of laws. Because we really think it was like the law of gravity. Like, do you get a ticket when you break the law of gravity? You know, it's like, you see how this language is weird, and it contains a worldview. That's kind of my whole point. Okay, so we've spent a really long time on this, which is important because mechanism is sort of the center from which all of these things are going to follow. We're going to go to break very briefly, and when we come back, I'm going to check chat, and then we're going to see about hitting the rest of these things that define the Enlightenment. We'll be right back. How do you explain the sacraments? It's easy to say they're mysteries that we have to take on faith or on the authority of tradition, but that is not how the early Christians understood them. To them, and to all ancient people, the idea that physical objects had spiritual power was very intuitive, whereas modern people tend to find this difficult, bizarre, or even unchristian. This is because we live in an era shaped by secularism, a way of viewing the world that's incompatible with sacramental thinking. Because secular ideas are at the heart of our culture, modern people tend to think in secular ways without realizing it, even the most well-meaning of us. How then do we live in, but not be of, a secular culture? We need to understand the enchanted, sacramental way that the early Christians viewed the world, but we also need to understand secularism. What is it really? Where did it come from? And how does it influence how we think about religion? Journey to Reality, Sacramental Life in a Secular Age breaks down these important issues in accessible, non-academic language and is an ideal introduction for young readers, catechumens, and seekers, as well as for any Orthodox Christians who want to deepen their understanding of the sacraments.
Journey to Reality, Sacramental Life in a Secular Age by Zachary Porcu. Now available at store.ancientfaith.com. Again, that is store.ancientfaith.com.
We are back. We are back with chat, anticipating the rest of what's on my outline, which is always a pleasure. So let me see. Yes, I'm enjoying a lot of these comments, but I'm not going to be able to get to them. Some shout outs here to the Minecraft crew. Let me jump around in a little bit out of order. So this is from Chris. Do you think there was any relation between viewing nature in mechanistic ways and the rise of the Industrial Revolution? Yes, of course, right? Because then if you mechanize nature, like, oh, it's a machine, so we can make it more efficient. We can harvest it more efficiently. We can create all these giant industrial systems and blah, blah. Yes, it absolutely follows from that. We're going to look at that a little bit more next week when we get to the 20th century. So, because again, you remember my example where the Greeks, I think we talked about this, where the ancient Greeks discovered the steam engine and then they were like, okay, because they had slaves, right? They didn't care. They didn't have a need for labor saving. They didn't think you needed to maximize the efficiency of all of these different things. Their society worked great, you know, insofar as any society works great. So this is from Nate. Last time you talked about how the idea came about that arguments that didn't rely on non-empirical arguments were considered stronger. This is when we talked about Anselm saying, you know, if the argument doesn't rely on revelation, if it's just on pure reason, it's a stronger argument. And then that became the fashion. Can you talk about the flaws of elevating empirical data so highly? Yes. I'm glad you asked. So, excuse me. So I'm going to answer that by getting into the next 2 points real quick, and then I'm going to jump back to chat. So there's two other fallouts of, all of these are kind of followed from mechanism, by the way. That's why I spent so long on it. So there's disenchantment and objectification. So there's two things that follow from mechanism. So we talked about disenchantment, which is the idea that in the ancient world and for the Christian era, pagan and Christian, they saw the physical and spiritual as being inherently connected, inherently related. You can't separate them. And so with mechanizing the universe, you do separate them because you take the spiritual part and you kind of throw it in this miscellaneous category. That's like the things we can't prove in a lab or with math category, i.e. not as important, kind of not as real. We're not really interested. This is the Enlightenment. So the universe then becomes amoral instead of moral, it becomes blind. This is the blind watchmaker, blind laws of physics, just a machine. You see all of that language. And ultimately, that means it becomes meaningless. And that's important. That's just a description, right? There's no inherent meaning in nature because there's no inherent meaning in a mechanized view of the whole universe. Make sense? And this is related to the third thing, to the idea of objectification. So let me talk briefly about this. We came up with these categories, the objective and the subjective. This is a post-Enlightenment way of viewing the world. So, and you see where it kind of starts in scholasticism. So objective things, what are those things? Those are things we can prove with math, with reason, with repeatedly verifiable empirical evidence. We can demonstrate them. If you and I disagree about the boiling point of water, we can go into the kitchen, we can do an experiment, and somebody's going to be wrong. And then there's, okay, so great. That's useful. Obviously, we make use of that. Well, what about all the other stuff? Well, those things are subjective. They're matters of personal opinion. You can't prove them in a lab, so they're sort of a second-tier citizen. Well, what's wrong with that? Well, because what goes in that category? Religious experience, in other words, all meaning and purpose to life. Aesthetic experience, if you have a profound experience with a work of art, you see a beautiful work of art, you listen to a beautiful piece of music, you cry. Okay, well, that's kind of just like your personal opinion. That's not part of the shared real reality that we all ascend to. So aesthetic experience, religious experience, morality, actually, relationships, love, beauty, all of those things in the trash. Bye-bye. Why? Because we can't prove them in a lab or with math or whatever. They become second-class citizens. So there's this objective-subjective dichotomy that comes out of the Enlightenment. And when you say, well, that's just subjective, people are like, well, yeah, I guess. It's like, my religion is subjective. Oh, well, I can't prove it. You know, that's where we get this, you know, I'm a Christian, but I'm not going to force my belief on anybody else. And it's like, Well, the only reason we force objective beliefs on each other because we think we can verify them. And then we don't force religious beliefs on each other because we're like, well, you can't prove it, so I guess it's just a matter of personal opinion. And the problem with this should be obvious, which is that all of the things that give life meaning are in the now labeled subjective pile, meaning that they can't be shared. You can't build a society on them. They're just internal to you, your own personal opinion, right? This is really problematic. And I wonder why. Flash forward to the 21st century, and we're living through the biggest mental health crisis. Mental health experts are calling it a mental health epidemic in the West. Depression, anxiety, suicide, the amount of people who are medicated, it's like shootings. It's like, why? It's like, it kind of looks like the whole Western world stopped believing in anything of meaning. I wonder why. When you mechanize the universe and you extract all the meaning out of it and you take all the things that are meaningful and you dump them in this subjective category. Now again, is this neutral? No. Because you say, well, that's religious. That's your personal opinion. But this is objective. This is something we can prove in a lab. But when you boil those two things down, the belief that the universe is reducible to mechanistic processes is not a scientifically proven belief. It's something that science assumes, but it's not something that science demonstrates because that would be circular. We're going to talk about this more I don't want to get ahead of myself. We're going to talk about this more in the series on science. But hopefully you're starting to get a sense of where this is going when you mechanize things. And so this results in a functional type of atheism, right? So there's this motion where it's like, so their loss of immanence happens in the West. We talked about that, no iconography. God is somewhere else. The clergy are separate from the lay people very much in the West and not really in the East. So there's a loss of eminence, but we're still doing Christianity. And then when we get to this mechanistic view of the universe, that's where we get deism, which is the belief that God exists. He made the watch, he wound it up, and then he left. He does not interact with the world. So the reason that there are all these laws is that God made them. Of course, God made them. All rational people, at this time would have been like, yes, there had to have been a first principle and a first cause of the physical universe. That was actually quite rational, and philosophers and mathematicians had all these proofs about why it had to be so. But they're also the same kind of people who would not sign off on Christianity per se, right? So Thomas Jefferson, famously, the Jefferson Bible, he took all the miracles out of the New Testament because he wanted to believe in a God that was this kind of watchmaker God. There's a first principle, like Aristotle. We all like Aristotle. There's a first principle that gives rise to the world, that establishes all the natural mechanistic laws. But that God then is somewhere else. So total transcendence, no immanence. He's gone. And the world just kind of keeps going. And we don't really have to worry about like formal religion. God just becomes like part of your cosmic physics theory, actually. But not anything that you would want to be religious about, because we all know religion is cringe. Like, that's basically what the Enlightenment guys would have said. Religion is cringe, so we need to secularize everything so it's presentable, it's decent, it's sort of acceptable. But there, you see how they're still using all of these principles in their worldview. Now, of course, it's a hop, skip, and a jump from deism to atheism, right? So God made the universe, but we never see him. He never writes, he never calls, he doesn't come over. Well, if somebody never writes and never calls, you never interact with them, may as well not be there, right? So we go from deism to atheism really easily. So, because deism is kind of a functional atheism. Okay, so what happens then? Well, man is just man. And man is the Lord and possessor of nature. He is the king. He's at the top of the dominance hierarchy of earth. We understand the world, and if we get the right mathematical formulas and the right principles, and we understand all of these things, then we can rule the world and reshape it into some utopian vision. We'll solve the engineering problem of the human. We'll solve the engineering problem of death. We'll solve the engineering problem of society. We'll solve it all because we can do it, because we have math and we have science, unlike the stupid Dark Ages. I give quotes, so you know I'm not making this up. So this is Rene Descartes. We're going to talk about him extensively when we do the series on modern philosophers. He's kind of a villain, actually, in retrospect. I think it took me 20 years to kind of come around to this belief. Anyway, here's the quote. He says, I perceived it to be possible to arrive at knowledge highly useful in life. And instead of the speculative philosophy usually taught in schools, I think he's making a dig against scholasticism, we will discover a practical method by means of which, knowing the force and action of fire, water, air, the stars, the heavens, and all the other bodies that surround us as distinctly as we know the various crafts of our artisans, meaning we'll understand how the stars and planets and everything work just as well as we understand metalworking or woodworking or whatever, we might also apply them in the same way to all the uses to which they are adapted and thus render ourselves, wait for it, the lords and possessors of nature. Totally triumphalistic, totally mind over matter. Man is God. We will become the lords and possessors of nature. Laplace's demon. If we know everything, we can predict the whole past and present and future. We'll know everything. And I want to emphasize to you, this is not a Christendom model, obviously, because it's too arrogant. It's too much hubris. And it's definitely not a pagan model. Goodness gracious. Zeus is going to get you guys if you try to become the lords and possessors of natures. No way. The gods are not going to allow that. Did you see the Trojan War? Did you see Icarus? No. So this is like, people didn't think with this sort of cosmic arrogance before. I mean, you always have lunatics, but as a whole society, the Enlightenment project is basically, we're going to take this Christian concept of fundamental human dignity, and we are going to take it all the way up to 11, and we're going to say, look, we're basically God now. God left, and man, through science, through knowledge, we are going to become the lords and possessors of nature. Crazy. Okay. And then finally is this concept of freedom. Now, I will at this time reveal to you, excuse me, the quote, the opening quote that I gave at the beginning. So it's from David Bentley Hart, who you may know. And I wanted to say this because I wanted to give a brief and disclaimer to this, because David Bentley Hart became kind of a controversial figure. So when I was an undergraduate, he was not a controversial figure. He was just a brilliant historian and scholar. And we read his books in undergrad, and they're really good. His early work is great, and I sign off on so much of it. Later, he became a universalist and kind of all these things. I kind of lost track of it, and I'm not interested in orthodrama, so I don't really know all of his positions on things. But my understanding is that he kind of, well, he embraces what we would call non-orthodox views, okay? So I'm not signing off on those views. I'm not a universalist. I don't want to cause any drama by quoting him, but I do want to be a good scholar and say you have to give people credit where credit's due. And he wrote very good texts early on that I still use all the time, because he was and is a good scholar, brilliant scholar, actually. So these quotes, all these quotes, the two at the beginning and the ones I'm about to say, are from his text, Atheist Delusions, which was written in response to Richard Dawkins' book, The God Delusion, sort of. So this is a funny story that he tells, actually. He said, I wanted to call this book The Christian Revolution and Its Fashionable Enemies, which is a way better title. And then the publisher was like, well, The God Delusion just came out, so let's call it Atheist Delusions. You know, it's like the clickbait kind of title. And he didn't want it to be titled that because it was clickbait. He's kind of cringe. And the publisher was like, well, we get to say what the title is. So they made his title the subtitle. So, and why am I saying all this? Because I think it's a really good book, but it has this kind of clickbaity title that might turn you off. But I think it's great. It's a brilliant summary in his characteristic sort of Baroque style of the idea that Christianity was the most powerful revolution in human history that totally transformed the pagan world into all these brand new concepts. We talked about this. Radical human dignity, the incarnation, conquering death. This is the most radical thing that anyone has ever said in human history. It's not even close, actually. And we'll talk about that when we do comparative religions. I'm excited for that too. And then the modern revolution, Hart characterizes this as this kind of lame counter-revolution to the Christian revolution. So anyway, now that you know way more than you asked about David Bentley Hart's book, I recommend. That's all. I will now tell you why I'm giving these two quotes. So these two quotes are important because Hart, I think, makes the very perceptive insight into this issue. He says, listen, the modern period talks about itself as being very reason-centric. The modern period talks about itself as caring about reason and science, and we're going to do things with rationality, and we're going to be objective, and blah, blah. And he says, that's not really true. He says, if you really look at these thinkers, and especially if you look at how modernity played out, he said, you'll realize that the ethos of this thing is freedom. That's what modernity is really about at its heart. So here's the quote. The modern period has never been especially devoted to reason as such. The notion that it ever was is merely one of its originary myths. The true essence of modernity is a particular conception of what it means to be free, as I have said, and the Enlightenment language of an age of reason was always really just a way of placing a frame around that idea of reason so as to portray it as the rational autonomy and moral independence that lay beyond the intellectual infancy of irrational belief. So in other words, irrational belief in God and faith-based stuff is going to be transcended by the age of reason. And that sounds really good on paper. But what Hart is saying is that the modern period actually really, truly, and deeply cares about a particular understanding of freedom. Freedom from authority, freedom from the church telling you what to do, freedom from oppressive clerical hierarchy. He said that really is the spirit of modernity. When you peel off all the branding, that's really what's going on underneath historically. And this whole narrative about the age of reason is just a way of justifying that. The same reason, in the same exact way that we talked about last time, where the so-called wars of religion were not really about religion. Religion was a pretext. Well, you guys are Catholic, we're Protestant. It's time for war, blah, blah. We want to be free of your religious oppression, blah, blah. No, that was just a pretext for these different nation states to power grab from each other and assert dominance over each other. You know this because France, who was Catholic, joined the Protestants in the 30 Years' War. They didn't take the side of their religion because the Catholic Church in France had already been totally absorbed by and was under the iron fist of the state. So the religious thing was a pretext for what? The independence of these states from each other and to conquer their rivals. In the same way, the idea of the age of reason over the age of faith is a fantasy. It's not real historically when we bear this out. Because again, the scholastic period was the most over-rational, rational to a fault age you could ever imagine. You have no, gosh, I want to talk about the medievals on their own at some point. These people were all brilliant polymaths. You will be bored to death by their rationalistic power levels. And it's actually jaw-dropping. And so you can't, if you call the Middle Ages, and my point in bringing that up is, if you call the Middle Ages the age of faith and not the age of reason, you have no idea what's going on in the medieval period, actually. Why? Why might you have no idea what's going on? Because of 500 years of Enlightenment propaganda doing what? Rewriting your mythic account of history. Okay, so we're going to get to this other quote by Hart, and then I think we'll stop here, and then I'll go to chat. So he says this: the myth of enlightenment served well to liberate us from any antique notions of divine or natural law that might place unwelcome constraints on our wills. Meaning, in the medieval world, they had divine law. People were like, yeah, church, authority, all this stuff. And natural law, too. There was law built into our human nature. The laws of nature. This is different than how it would come out in the Enlightenment. And those place what? Unwelcome constraints on our wills, what we want. And then he goes on and says, but this mythic idea of enlightenment, it has discharged its part and lingers on now only as a kind of habit of rhetoric. Freedom for us today is something transcendent even of reason. And we no longer really feel that we must justify our liberties by recourse to some prior standard of responsible rationality. Freedom, conceived as the perfect, unconstrained spontaneity of individual will is its own justification, its own highest standard, its own unquestionable truth. And I think you see that whenever you talk about these social issues. Like, this is why all the conversations about hot topic social issues, they go nowhere. And why conservatives have nothing to say. Because you're like, well, pick an issue. Euthanasia, transgenderism, homosexual marriage, whatever. And you're like, well, there's some law of nature that says that you shouldn't do this, or some divine law. You shouldn't commit suicide. Sexuality has built into it a certain heteronormativity. That's to say that is to assume that there's like this divine or natural law to the universe. And then the liberal position goes, yeah, but they want to. And then everybody's like, oh, I don't know. It's such a moral dilemma. Euthanasia. This person wants to do euthanasia. They want to. But it's like bad to do that. But they want to. Well, I don't know what to do now. It's a moral dilemma. And why would there be a moral dilemma? Because you believe that the individual will, what I want, is the most important thing. That is a uniquely modern assumption that comes out of the Enlightenment, that characterizes modernity, and was not an idea that the ancients and medievals had, by and large. Again, I'm overgeneralizing. But you see what I mean? You assume these things because you are modern, liberal, secular, whatever, to some degree. This is the world you grew up in. So you have these categories. But those are new. They're new, they're unprecedented, they're not morally neutral, and they assume a worldview, a very specific worldview with a very specific conception of freedom, which we will talk about next week. Okay. There's all this other stuff I have on here about the nation state, but we don't have time. So we'll do it next week. And we'll talk more about politics, which everybody loves doing. Yes. Okay. I want to jump into chat. What is happening in chat? A mechanistic view of the universe does kind of deny lived human experience as being real. This is from Harry. How would you avoid cognitive dissonance in believing in such a reality? I don't know. I don't know. And this is a really good question, because the question is, look, okay, if you assume a totally mechanistic view of the universe, if you remove all the religion, quote unquote, the religion stuff, then what you've done is you've removed all human meaning, love, friendship, joy, beauty, truth, aesthetic experience, religious experience, purpose, and actually morality. You remove morality. Morality is a construct on this view. It has to be. And even, we don't have time to get into this, even the concept of the mind of persons ends up being something that we can't really demonstrate. Okay, so if you are just reducible to mechanism, then what's you? And you're like, well, what do you mean? I'm like, well, you think things. Like, well, I think this. And it's like, well, that's just chemical reactions in your brain. It's like, okay. Does your brain feel sad? Or do you feel sad? Turns out there's a difference. Well, you feel sad is not something we can ascribe exactly to a brain state in the same sense. So the you part must kind of be illusory. I mean, free will is at least illusory on a totally mechanistic view of reality. So in order to have no cognitive dissonance on this, you at least have to totally commit to the idea that there is no such thing as morality, because that's right or that's wrong or that's good or that's evil. Those are cosmic and moral statements. They're not empirical. You could just say, well, altruism is just evolved evolutionary psychology. It's beneficial for survival or whatever. And then you also have to say, like, no, there are no minds. No minds exist. The idea that I'm a me and I'm not just a collection of chemical reactions operating in a mechanistic manner is an illusion. You kind of have to double down on that. But then you have a problem because it's like, well, who's talking? It becomes very strange. A few secular philosophers even pointed this out. Yes. Yeah, lots of people have pointed this out because it's clearly a contradiction. And that's why the Enlightenment dream ends up dying off ultimately, and why we're seeing a resurgence in what you would call supernatural, superstitious kind of weird beliefs that people are having now. And I want to talk about this when we get into postmodernity. Harry asks, so pure empiricism is perhaps self-refuting? Yes, it is. And so there's a wonderful philosopher, Alvin Plantinga, who has a formal argument about how empiricism basically is self-refuting. It's very funny, actually. I'm still reading chat here. This explains why the modern dating scene with apps and all has become a mechanistic hellscape. Yeah, absolutely. So we're using machines now to mechanize every part of our lives. And then what happens? You start treating people like commodities. And then when you're doing these dating apps, like, I'm sure you feel mechanized by the process itself, don't you? I mean, you're commodified. If you're kind of messaging somebody and that person is messaging 6 other people in the same way, just trying to choose the best one, it's like, ugh, you know. When I was growing up, you got a girl's number, you were texting her. It was like a big deal, you know. It's a big deal. I'm texting this girl. Like, you had to meet this person to get her phone number. You know what I'm saying? It's completely different now. And what is it? It's mechanized because we always choose convenience. We just always choose convenience over quality to the point where that we're gonna build a hellscape here. Okay, what else do we got? So Troy points out, this is one useful thing from postmodern thought. They pointed out that there are no neutral frameworks. Yes, I would sign off on that. Now, the problem with postmodernity, and I want to get into this next week. I'm not sure how much we're going to get into it. But the problem with postmodernity is that postmodernity makes all these critiques of the Enlightenment, which is good because there are obvious self-contradictory issues with the Enlightenment framework. But then postmodernity is kind of funny because postmodernity is a disenchanted version of the Enlightenment, which is a disenchanted version of Christianity. So it's like the Enlightenment was like, nah, we're going to get rid of reason, or we're going to get rid of religion and all this aesthetic stuff. It's all subjective, but we're going to have absolute reason and science and math and stuff. And then when all of that breaks down in the 20th century, then the postmoderns are like, well, that broke down, so we can't believe in that either. So I guess everything is subjective? ? And so now you're in a huge disaster because you have no way out. Then reason itself becomes self-refuting or illusory or whatever. And so, yes, postmodernity's critique is important, but it has no solution. It's just dismal. I mean, if it had a solution, we wouldn't be here. Dover says, loved your book. Thank you. Appreciate it. Do you have further recommended reading, particularly on untangling the modern worldviews, which are causing suffering in the name of individual will? Yeah, good question. Do I have other readings? The real answer to this, so I'm hesitating. I'm writing a sequel to Journey to Reality, actually. Spoiler. And it's going to be on all of these questions that people have asked me after reading Journey to Reality, which is, okay, how do we live our lives? How do we deal with social issues? How do we understand like all this situation of like, okay, we liked your book, good. The RK, great. Sacramentalism, good. Journey to Reality, awesome. What do we do now? We live in this secular hellscape. And the sequel is going to address all of those things. I think you'll like it, but it's not coming out soon. It's not coming out this year, probably. Definitely, it's not coming out this year. So we'll see. We'll see. I'll keep you posted, though. Absolutely, because a lot of people are asking about this. Is there other reading? Yeah. But I mean, there's like an infinite amount of other reading. But again, I'm always pitching Father Strickland's series. If you really want to understand how we got to where we are here, and you're willing to read 400-page books. Which the reading style is very good, by the way. It's a page turner for a nonfiction book, I think. If you're willing to do that and put in the reading, I think it's great. I recommend. But I understand people don't, it's not a short project. Okay, last one here, Nate. This sounds weird, but I have trouble understanding how I was able to function as an atheist for so long. Like, how did I not go insane like Nietzsche? I guess it's cognitive dissonance. Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, cognitive dissonance is really easy. Everybody will say like, oh yeah, I'm an atheist, blah, blah. And then they turn around and they talk in very harsh terms about morality. I'm an atheist, but Trump is the devil. I'm an atheist, but corporations are evil. I'm an atheist, but the Catholic Church is morally compromised. It's like, well, then you have a belief in morality. And I think the reason that you were able to do that, I don't know, you'll have to guess, right? But I think the reason you were able to do that is because it's kind of like the Enlightenment modern world is sort of living on the steam, like living on the fumes of Christendom. In other words, we still have a Christian moral framework in this society. It's very faint, it's very tenuous, it's very disconnected from all the traditional Christian sources for that morality, but it's still a dream that we all want to believe in. We all want to believe in radical human dignity. We all want to believe in right and wrong. We all want to believe in good and evil because that's basic to the human experience. Like, it's not that I'm understating this. It's not that we want to believe in those things. We do believe in those things. We do. We just have to figure out a way to justify our belief in those things. So you're kind of living on that human impulse to like believe in morality, because most people are not. It's hard to be totally intellectual. A lot of people aren't willing to put in the time and energy to like really follow beliefs all the way to their logical conclusions. You sign up, you're like, I'm mad at my religious parents. What do you got for me? And they're like, here's God delusion. You can just be a bitter atheist. And here's your script. It's like, or same thing. Like, I'm mad at my stupid atheist parents. Like, here's evangelicalism. We got a script for you. It's like you buy these scripts and then you kind of, it's like pick a worldview. And then what is it doing for you? Why am I being so condescending right now? I'm just saying, I'm kind of being funny. I'm just saying people sign up for worldviews because it's convenient. You need a worldview to survive, unless you do a lot of drugs, I guess. Like, you need a worldview to make it through the day. And it's easy to buy these prepackaged worldviews depending on what your pain is. And that's different than really following the argument where it leads and really digging all the way down. That's very difficult to do. That's a lot of time and energy and work. Not everybody's equipped to do that for all kinds of reasons, right? So it's easier to buy it's prefab worldview. It's easier to purchase this. You buy a couple books, you start going to this group, church, whatever, boom, you're in. So that's why why am I saying all this? Because that's why people never resolve their cognitive dissonances, because we're never looking to do so. Actually, it's too hard. And I mean, I'll throw myself under the bus too. Like, when I was a Protestant, I'd read the Bible. I'm like, oh yeah. So I had this prepackaged way of reading the Bible, a Protestant way. And I became Orthodox a long time ago. And I was rereading the Bible, and I was like, oh my goodness, it's all here. It's all here. It was here the whole time. I said to my wife, what book was I reading before? Well, what happened? I am bringing a different set of interpretive lenses to it. It's not that I read the text and understood it. It's that I read the text through an interpretive filter. That's normal. Everybody does that, because how else do you function? Again, there's no view from nowhere. So in a sense, I'm like making fun of people right now, but not really. Ultimately, you have to go easy on yourself and everyone else, because everybody else is just trying to understand the world. And we're in pain and we're trying to understand the world. We want to not be in pain. It's very basic. So, let's see, did I miss anything here? Potentially. I think we got there. I think this is good enough for today. I don't want to overload you guys. So next week, there's all this stuff that I saved to talk about the nation state, the secular nation state. And I'll say a little bit about it next week. And next week, we're going to get into, so we're going to take the Enlightenment, we're going to walk it all the way up to the 20th century and the world wars. And this is very important because it's going to bear out, okay, the Enlightenment guys had this dream, the dream of the Enlightenment. Amazing. It's going to be great. It's going to be great, I promise. Utopia, no more constraints on our wills, freedom, everyone's going to be enlightened, it's going to be great. Did it happen? Spoilers, no. Okay, so why? And what are we doing about it? And maybe where are we going? So next week is going to be we're going to be wrapping up. This is the last week in the 4-part series on secularism. Come and bring all your extra questions, because we're going to get into it. I'm going to underprepare a little bit, he says, he hopes. And we're going to have some more time to get into chat to talk about kind of all the things. I know you guys want to talk about, well, where are we going? What do we think about what's happening in the 21st century? Come, bring all that. We'll do it. I'll make some time for it. So thank you guys. Love it. Good questions today. Looking forward to next week. And you know what I'm going to say. This has been a listener and viewer supported presentation of Ancient Faith Radio. See you guys next week.